Hello and welcome to the first ever live Chats with Chip episode. I am your host, Chip Griffin, and I am joined today by Patrick Rogan of Ignition HR. Welcome to the show, Patrick.
Thank you, Chip. Happy to be here.
It is great to have you. I believe you've been a guest before, although not on a live edition because this is our first ever live edition. So this will be going out as an Agency Leadership TV episode on the Agency Leadership website and also out on the Chats with Chip feed. So you may be seeing or hearing this in one of those places. If you are here live, feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions, and we'll try to get to those over the course of our conversation. But we're going to be spending some time today talking about some of the HR issues and challenges that agency leaders are facing right now. Because, Patrick, I don't know about you, but I hear there's something going on out in the world. It's not quite status quo.
Yeah, things are a little bit different.
Yeah, being under house arrest is certainly an interesting environment. It is not exactly how I planned for 2020. I don't know anybody who did have this in their strategic plan for the year, but we all are making the best of it. And obviously, in the agency world, folks have a lot of challenges. Fortunately, you have a lot of expertise in HR challenges in the agency and professional services world. So I am very pleased that you're able to join us and talk through some of those challenges that everybody has.
Sure.
Let's dive right in. And as we look at what's going on right now, to me, the first thing is communication, right? Because everybody's concerned. Owners are concerned, leaders are concerned, employees are concerned, their families are concerned, and it's multifaceted. And so, to me, one of the most important things as a leader in any organization is to be communicating effectively, right? So, what communications challenges or things should that folks be keeping in mind with their teams? So not externally, but with the actual agency.
Yeah. So I think you really hit it on the head, Chip, when you said communicating effectively. I would add to that communicating frequently as well. And I think when we think about the audience that we're communicating to, the default is as broad an audience as possible. So lots of times we think about the people who we have on our normal team that maybe we have weekly calls or a couple of weekly calls where we're talking about projects that we're working on and deliverables that are due and that type of thing. But sometimes there are other parts of the organization. Maybe there's some part-time employees or maybe there's some consultants and we'd like to bring them into the fold a little bit as well too. It kind of gives them a sense of belonging. And that's an area where I think a lot of organizations are doing a much better job.
Mm-hmm. And I think the one-on-one communications are particularly important too, right? Because a lot of folks won't share, their real concerns if they've got peers sitting next to them. They really need to have that opportunity with their supervisors to be able to share what's really on their minds.
Yeah, and I think being able to have those one-on-one, particularly as it relates to feedback, is really, really important. And feedback, obviously, there are two sides of feedback, right? So there's positive feedback, hey, you did a great job on this. And there's constructive feedback in terms of, hey, this could be a little bit better. Next time when we do this, why don't you try it this way? Both of those avenues, I think, resonate really, really well with employees. And now more than ever, because people are, you said it earlier, there's a little bit more going on, a little bit more stress in the background. We need to work a little bit harder to keep those relationships going as business owners.
Mm-hmm. And, I think one of the things that employees tend to notice are clients who go away. And the data seems to suggest that somewhere in the neighborhood of about 80% of agencies have lost revenue as a result of what's been going on the last 6 weeks or so. So almost every agency employee, no matter what space they're in, has seen some loss of clients. And so that makes them worry about their own jobs and the future of the business. How transparent should agency owners and agency leaders be? And how do they find that right balance of not lying to the employees, but still trying to reassure them?
Yeah, I think being as honest as possible is key. And I think acknowledging the fact to employees that there are unknowns, and depending upon which way those unknowns go could have an impact on the size of the organization going forward, and it may impact some individual jobs. I think it's okay to go ahead and get that out. When you say that, though, I think it's important for employees to understand that as business owners, we have a specific process that we're going to be going through, and that when we have to let go of staff, it is the last possible resort. Because there's a tendency, my experience, when there's a lack of information, employees are going to use their imaginations to fill in the gaps.
Mm-hmm.
And almost always, those imaginations will be far more negative than reality. So the more we can do to kind of help them understand exactly what the situation is, what the next steps are, what the process is going to be, approximately when we think people are going to be able to find out, it just helps remove a lot of the stress, and it kind of alleviates some of those grand imaginary things that employees will dream up by fact, or at least as much information as we can give them.
Mm-hmm. And I like how you underscored, being honest and not necessarily sugarcoating it, because I think there is a tendency for leaders, owners to say, don't worry about it, everything's going to be okay until the last possible minute, and then they're like, okay, well, crap, now we've got to cut costs. So it tends to come more out of the blue from employees in that scenario.
Right. Yep. Totally agree.
And I think, having run businesses and seen both 2001 and 2008, and I know you've seen those as well, my general experience is that most businesses wait, particularly in this space, wait far too long to make headcount reductions because they just keep hoping that they can find a way so that they can avoid that very unpleasant outcome that, nobody wants to have happen.
Yeah. And I think while you're taking the steps to make those decisions, very difficult decisions that have to be made, I think it's also important to look at your talent needs from a broader perspective at the same time. So yes, maybe a difficult decision has to be made, but since I'm looking at my talent anyway, a good question to ask yourself is, well, do I have the right talent now to begin with?
Right.
And are there areas where I should perhaps broaden it a little bit? Or maybe, even though these are very difficult times, maybe there's some talent that I have access to that I wouldn't normally. And maybe in this case, I should take a hard look at that. So it's not all negative. There might be some positive things here too. And I think looking at that glass sort of half full can be really, really helpful right now, given certain situations. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. And one of the things that I've been saying for the last several weeks is, that Rahm Emanuel is someone you should listen to, and not necessarily politically, but one of the things that he famously said during the 2008 economic crisis or shortly thereafter was, never let a good crisis go to waste.
Yeah.
and it's harsh, but I agree with the sentiment, because you need to take advantage of this opportunity if you do need to make staff changes, to take a look at the whole picture and say, as you've said, not necessarily just what do you need to cut, what do you need, what could you add, how do you restructure overall. And so taking a much more broad creative view is a smarter approach than just saying, okay, my bean counter says I need to cut 25,000 in costs, let me just go find those 25,000.
Right. Yeah, being a little bit more strategic about that process is really important right now.
Yeah. And if you are someone who is in the position where you unfortunately do have to cut staff, how should you go about figuring? I mean, we've talked a little bit about figuring out what you need for the future, but should you factor in how long someone's been with you? It should just be skills based. Should it just be position based? Should you remove people who they were working on certain clients that went away? What advice would you have for folks as they're thinking through how to make these difficult decisions?
Well, looking further along in the process, Chip, one of the things I always recommend when, let's say we've gone through everything that you've just described and we're actually having the conversation with the employee and we're saying, unfortunately, we need to have a difficult decision based upon a variety of reasons that have impacted the business. We have to eliminate your position. And this is what that means. So the variety of business conditions are the things that you have to think about at the beginning of that process. So certainly there's someone's skills and your need is the organization. Those are the business, the projects, what are the needs? You weigh them all together. And then ultimately you have to make a decision that's best for your business. And then you have the communication later on. In the background, just keep in mind, there are certain factors that are not appropriate for considering. And they're the normal things, but I always like to mention them. So some of them are federal law and regulation related. Some are state law and regulation related, but race, color, creed, age, all those things cannot be a factor. Someone who's out on pregnancy leave being a factor in deciding whether to let someone go, illegal, can't do that. So just kind of keep those in the back of your mind. Keep it strictly to the business. Look at what your organization needs now and in the future, and how long can you make it with the staff that you have? Those are the primary factors you should be looking at, and things are going to work out just fine.
Mm-hmm. And I think, you've highlighted something really important there, which is to make sure that you're in compliance. Anytime you're making staff changes like this, particularly because, folks it's a stressful time. If you're letting people go now, you're putting them out into a very difficult job market because, we've seen what has happened with unemployment numbers in recent weeks. So this is not like, you're the only one affected. They'll have a fine time landing on their feet somewhere else. It's probably going to be a while before they get picked up somewhere else. So, you want to make sure that you're not inadvertently stepping in something or deliberately stepping in it because you're a little rash. So talking to an HR consultant or legal counsel or those kinds of things, I think is particularly important before you undertake layoffs.
It's time well spent. I mean, there's so many state and local laws now that are different, that impact little things you wouldn't normally think of. Like, for instance, in some states, if you terminate an employee and their employment, you have to give them their last paycheck on the day you deliver the news. In other states, it could be a week. In other states, it's the normal pay cycle. So little things like that, it's just good to get a little outside help to make sure you're on the straight and narrow there.
Right. No, that makes sense. And there are different ways that you can, to your point there about having to give that last paycheck, there are different approaches that you can take to this. True, right? You could use garden leave, for example.
Right.
And maybe that's a concept we should explain, but you can furlough people. There are, you can do pay cuts. I mean, there's a gazillion different ways that you can cut costs. Let's talk through some of them because, they have their pros and cons. Since I mentioned garden leave, why don't you explain what garden leave is? And I think it's particularly relevant in this scenario because of the payroll protection program, right? Because that's basically encouraging employers to keep people for a period of time.
Right.
But if you've lost a lot of business, you may be sitting there saying, once that money's up, I don't have the money to keep paying you.
Right. Well, you have a number of different options. One is you can cut back on an employee's hours. You can put them into part-time status. In most jurisdictions, if it's at least 30 hours a week, they can still be full-time status, but you cut some of the cost out so they're able to keep their benefits. That's one option to consider. Another option, we talked about it before, maybe you can afford to continue paying for benefits, so you want to furlough them for a period of time. That gives them some cushion. But sometimes that's not even doable either. And, depending upon the impact on the business, then maybe you just have to do a reduction in force, at which case, unfortunately, that's the least advantageous to the employee. But who knows? When business comes up, you could certainly bring them back on board down the road. So there are a number of different options that we have. I think the best thing to do is kind of look at your business situation first, and then figure out what can we do in terms of having the right talent to get you what you need to do to get your job done.
Right. And it will vary a little bit from jurisdiction to jurisdiction what the pros and cons are, because furloughs, for example, the rules can vary substantially from state to state as far as how that gets treated from an unemployment perspective. For the most part now, in the midst of this current crisis, furloughs are being treated in such a way that you can get full unemployment benefits, but it may vary for your particular area, and you want to look at that. You obviously want to look at what the impact is with your insurance policies, and are they okay with you taking that approach? So make sure that you've crossed the T's and dotted the I's here, so that you don't think you came up with a great solution only to find out the hard way that you didn't.
Yeah. And then you may have some employees who are going to have to perhaps go out on a sick leave, and under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, FFCRA, you have some relief as an employer if you have under 500 employees. So you've got 80 hours that you can get. You can provide leave to employees if it's related to coronavirus largely, that you'll be able to get a payroll tax credit down the road. And then after that...
But importantly, you have to pay them now, right? So
you have to pay them now, but then you get a payroll tax credit down the road.
Right, but I know for some agencies that's been an issue. Because the money comes out of their pocket now, but they don't get the tax credit until later.
Right.
And it was. I'm not sure that when Congress passed that, they thought it out quite as well as they should have from a cash flow perspective for a hurting business.
Right.
Because it's a fairly generous policy, if I recall correctly. For example, simply having to take care of a kid who's out of school, I believe, will qualify you as being able to take paid leave.
It does, and it's up to $510 per day per employee, up to 80 hours for sick leave. And then there's also, for that same condition, Skip, for family medical leave, you get an additional 12 weeks of paid leave, and that's up to $200 a day. So it is, and if you can manage the cash flow, you do get all that back.
Right.
It's just going to take, obviously, a little bit of time.
Right. And I think that is one of those things that a lot of agencies aren't even aware of an obligation for. Fortunately, I think for them, most of their employees probably aren't aware either, so they're not asking for it.
Right.
But it's still, it is something important to be aware of because it can have a real impact on your business, particularly as a small agency.
So one thing for small agencies also to consider, Chip, is that in some cases, we talked about the cash flow, but in other cases, if you have a very small agency, having an employee out for 2 weeks of sick leave and then 12 weeks of FMLA leave may be critical to the business. So there are rules for organizations with 25 or less employees where if there's a significant impact upon the business, then you can elect not to provide this benefit to employees. So no one wants to be in that situation but legally they did that for a reason, because for smaller organizations, you could very well go out of business if you have a key stakeholder who's not going to be able to hold up their end of the work that needs to be done. So, so that's another thing that, people should just keep in mind. They have it as an option.
Yeah. I mean, I've run small businesses with less than 25 employees, and I've had people go out on even unpaid leave, and that can be very damaging to the business for an extended period of time. So, it's certainly something to be aware of. Getting back to the, reducing costs as it relates to staff, what's your view on across the board pay cuts in an organization? Is that a good idea? Is it something you should ask first? Should you just do it unilaterally? Should you only do it if someone comes to you? What's your thinking on that?
So I've seen it done a couple of different ways. The ones that have resonated the best with me is on a sliding scale. So that your higher income employees have a larger percent than lower income employees.
Mm-hmm.
There are different ways to do it. The thing is, there just needs to be consistency with the methodology. As long as there is, I think I think employees appreciate it. If it keeps their job, it keeps their benefits. I think it's worth consideration, but it can be a little tricky.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll be honest with you, I'm not generally a fan of across the board pay cuts. I think if executive teams want to take one as sort of a morale boost in conjunction with some reductions in headcount, that's fine. But I'm not a huge fan of across the board pay cuts because they're not the kind of thing that really can last. But unfortunately, usually once they go into place, they don't disappear for quite some time, and so it can be real damaging to morale over time.
I agree. The only time I've seen them work well is when there is a true time-sensitive, specific period, and then at that point, then it goes back. But we can't say that with the situation that we have now. Right. How long do we know this is going to last? Your guess is as good as mine.
Right. I mean, and I've said I think that's the biggest problem with the current scenario. It's the uncertainty over what's happening, and even in some of these past recoveries, you could put a plan together and say, okay, here's how we're going to work our way out of it. Here, we don't even know when the circumstances are going to change for most of us. So it's very, very challenging to plan. But let's say we're going the route of we do decide that we need to reduce headcount. So whatever number of employees. What is your guidance? Should I rip the Band-Aid off and do it all at once? Should I, if I know I have to do 10 employees, do I do that now and then kind of say, okay, well, in 2 or 3 weeks, I'll figure out if I need to go further. Let's talk through a little bit sort of how you do it strategically, big picture, and then I want to talk a little bit about how you handle the individual meetings themselves.
For sure.
This is an important topic that most agency owners just don't have to deal with.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit earlier about the importance of understanding the business reasons why you may need to make a change in your staffing. And I think the more analysis and time you put there, you're going to get good results in terms of how this ends up. But in general, I recommend if you can have one action that involves staff over a very long period of time, that is a best practice. The last thing, the most demoralizing thing for staff is if you have one person, their position's eliminated 1 week, and then 3 weeks later, another one. It becomes death of a thousand cuts. And it just becomes very kind of a real morale downer in the workplace, and the employees just kind of hate it. So I would say do your analysis up front. Get your numbers where they are. Figure out. Obviously, you have to make some assumptions. Make the assumptions. Make a call, and then you can at that point honestly say to employees, "Listen, unfortunately, we've had to take this action. These are the positions that have been impacted. Unfortunately, as of this date, these individuals are no longer with the organization. We're going to do all our best to help them land somewhere else. We're confident and hopeful that we won't have to make this decision again in the future. But based upon what we can see right now, these are all the actions we're going to take." You can say that with an honest face, and that's going to go a long way with staff feeling a little bit more comfortable in very uncertain times.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely great advice, because you really don't want to be in that situation where you are just kind of, you keep cutting away at the confidence of the team, and everybody's wondering, is today the day that I go? So the more that you can take care of it all at once, at least given what obviously unforeseen circumstances happen, but based on what you know today. So, my advice is typically cut a little bit more than you think you really need to.
Yeah.
So, it's better to err on the side, particularly right now, because there's a lot of talent that's out there now, unfortunately. Unfortunately for them, fortunately for the employers.
Right.
So, you're going to have a much easier time adding people back than you are if you let 10 people go now, and then you find out you have to let 2 people go in a month, and 3 people go after that. That's just, overestimate what you need to trim in order to be healthy. And I think you'll be in a better position. And I know it sounds almost heartless to say it, but you have to, as an owner, as a leader, you need to think about the survival of the organization first.
Right.
Because if you do something to protect a small number of employees, you may end up harming the whole employee base by your inaction today.
Yeah, it's a much easier decision and a much easier process to go through to let 11 employees go this week, and 2 weeks later offer one of those employees a job back,
Right.
than to let 10 employees go this week and then 2 weeks let one more go. That's devastating.
Right. And I think, agencies really need to be thinking about this, because they have by and large lost revenue. They are by and large at least trying to get the PPP money.
Right.
So they're in a position where they're not letting people go now, because that's the condition of getting loan forgiveness.
Better not. Yeah.
You're smart to hold on to those people, but you don't want to wait until the PPP money runs out to then decide that you need to reduce headcount. Take advantage of this breathing room that the PPP is giving you, and make the appropriate changes. Let people know, you 10 people, when the PPP runs out, we're going to have to let you go. So you're basically using the government's money to pay them their severance in the form of a garden leave type situation.
Right.
You're being as gentle and as kind to those employees as possible. And
Right.
You're not putting the business in a bad place by waiting to the last minute to deal with it.
Yep.
So.
And by being flexible like that, you will open yourself up to a little bit of risk, because if an employee knows they're going to be leaving eventually, maybe they check out a little bit earlier. That's a risk. But you know what? Everyone else saw how fair you were.
Correct.
And that counts for a lot as well, too.
Absolutely. So now let's talk about the meetings themselves. And I'm sure we could do probably a whole hour, with guidance on how to actually have layoff type meetings with individuals. But let's talk about some of the basics. Is there a better time of day of the week to do it? If you've got multiple people to lay off, and not enough leadership team members to actually perform those actions, how do you sequence it? And obviously it's a little bit different now, because nobody's in an office for the most part.
Right.
So normally you
Right.
have the issue, everybody's in the office, everybody can see.
Right.
Now, on the one hand, you don't have that, but you do have everybody will, instant message each other right away, or text each other right away. So, how do you handle the meetings themselves?
Yeah. So it's important that they be handled, first of all, as professionally as possible. You generally want to be brief. Don't apologize. The situation is the situation. We need to have a difficult decision. we've reviewed, we've talked about it in our meetings all along. We've had some challenges on the business side. And as a result of that, your position is being eliminated. This is what, or maybe not, what we're going to be able, maybe we can offer you outplacement or whatever going forward. You kind of lay it out. You give a pause. You let them kind of digest. Keep in mind that how an employee responds to that piece of information is probably going to be a surprise to you, because it's not often that you're going to see that employee with that amount of stress. And how people operate under stress. There's normal style of behavior, there's stress style of behavior. You never really know what that's going to be. So keep in mind that the employee may be shocked, even though there should be no surprise. Everyone knew this was maybe going to come. It 9 times out of 10, the employee is going to be shocked. Sometimes they're going to be mad. Sometimes they're going to be like, so what are you saying? I mean, I have this project I'm working on, like it's called denial. Well, you kind of have to make sure they really understand, and be supportive. Let them know what next steps are, and it should really be about a 5-minute conversation.
Mm-hmm. And you should have all the paperwork ready, right, going into it. You shouldn't. This is not something where you have the conversation, then you get the paperwork together afterwards. You should have it. I mean, obviously, it's not going to be in person again, but you'll be emailing it to them during the conversation. During
the conversation, you should be sending them a letter that outlines everything that you've just discussed. You mentioned timing. Always better in the morning. Think about it from the employee's perspective. As soon as they find out that their position is ending, they want to look at finding their next position. If you let them know at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, they can't call any headhunters. They can't call their network. Everyone's done for the day. Make it early in the day, early in the week. It just makes
and now they can't even go to the bar.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, wonderful. Then you'll get a really nice email. Right. And then if it's going to be multiple individuals, just do them as in as quick a period as you can. Obviously, text messages are going to start flying. There's nothing you can do over that. You really have no control over that situation. It sort of is what it is, but you want to get the word out there as quickly as possible. They're going to have to be like this conversation right here, either Zoom or whatever means you have of connecting with people. That's the only way we can connect right now. But
certainly, I mean, since you can't do it in person, which is always preferred,
right.
Video is the next best.
It is,
as opposed to just a phone call or something like
right.
that. And by all means, never do it by email or text or in writing. No matter what it takes, get them in a voice-to-voice situation. It's a lot easier now to do that because all conversations are taking place that way.
Right.
But don't think you're getting the easy way out by doing a mass email or something crazy.
No, it's so impersonal. And it's organizations still do that, and it blows my mind.
Yeah.
Because it is just not the way people like to be.
Well, I mean, people generally speaking don't like to fire people, and they certainly don't like to lay people off. Particularly if it's through no fault of their own. So it is challenging. I get that, but that's not an excuse. Okay, so we've had the meeting with the individuals. Now we should bring the whole team together, right, and share with them what's taken place, and that it's done. That we're not going to keep going.
Right, and that should be done in a video conference if at all possible, because you want to let everyone have the message at the same time. They need to see in your eyes when you describe the process that you went through to make those decisions. They need to see in your eyes that you really did. Like reading doesn't really cover, and they need to know whether you're sincere or not about you think that this is where we need to be from a staff perspective, or I just took a stab in the dark here. Maybe we'll be having this conversation again next week. Hopefully not that.
Right.
So keep in mind when you're having that conversation, you may get some anxiety from your other staff, because obviously what are they going to be wondering? What's this going to mean for me?
Right.
Is my workload going to increase? Is it going to double? Is my position now in jeopardy? Keep in mind, they're going to have all those thoughts flying around in their head, and you want to do your best to kind of calm things down and set them at ease. There's going to be a little bit of survivor's remorse, in that conversation. There might be a little bit of shock. As much as you think that people should understand these things are coming, the reality is it's always going to be a surprise.
Right. And I think it's particularly important, too, to make sure that in your messaging, you're respectful of the employees that you've had to let go. And unfortunately, this is a lesson that gets lost quite a bit, because I think there's a tendency for some managers to overcompensate and say, look, don't worry about it. We're going to be okay. That they were our lowest performers anyway.
Oh, wrong
And,
thing to say. Yeah.
well, and actually, I just saw this earlier this week. A holding company executive
Oh,
publicly said the people we're letting go are our lowest performers. I mean, it is the absolute worst example of management that you can set ever, because now anybody who's let go from that agency, it looks like they're just terrible employees. So that's, and the reality is layoffs typically are not that. Even most run-of-the-mill terminations in good times are not necessarily that they were low performer. It may just have been the wrong fit for the
yeah,
organization at that time.
absolutely.
And so I think you really need to go out of your way to be respectful, because first of all, you never know where those employees are going to end up. They may end up at a potential client of yours in the future. So
For sure.
you don't want them to bear you ill will. But more importantly, for the rest of your team, if you start bad mouthing departed employees, they're going to wonder what you say about them.
The character of an organization is determined by how you handle the situation when times are tough. So the conversation you have with that employee who's going to be leaving, the conversation you have with your staff, they are all definitions of the character of your organization. A little
Right.
bit of pressure, but I think it's important to recognize that's where the rubber meets the road.
Yep. All right. Well, we've talked enough about sort of the painful things that you have to do with employees to reduce headcount and costs. Let's talk about some of the other realities that we have in our organizations from an HR standpoint right now. One that comes to mind is performance management of your team
Yeah,
today, and because their KPIs are probably out the window in all
right,
likelihood.
right.
Whatever goals you set as an organization or with your individuals back in November or December of last year, odds are people aren't going to be able to hit them.
Right,
It depends on exactly what they were, but chances are it's going
right.
to be difficult to hit them. People are now working remotely, so the way that you manage has changed a little bit. So let's talk about some of those challenges. Let's start with sort of the basics of performance management: goals, objectives, KPIs. How should you look? Should you throw them out and start over? Should you just say, look, for right now, we're just focused on getting through month to month, and we'll give you continuous feedback, but we're not going to worry about specific objectives? How would you handle that?
So the process part of performance management, I'm advising my clients, take a breather on that. Focus on lots of communication, lots of feedback, making sure that things are getting done the way they need to be done, the old-fashioned way. I think, focusing on competencies and mid-year reviews and year-end appraisals and all those kind of things, which there's a whole school of thought in terms of how much value they add anyway. But I really wouldn't focus on those process things right now. I would focus a lot more on the communications. I think that's where the value is going to be. And I wouldn't get too hung up with some of those things. Certainly, at the end of the day, our employees have to perform. But we need to recognize as managers that there's a lot more non-work related information we're going to hear dealing with our employees than we've ever heard before. And we might as well just get used to that, because that's just the way things are for a while. And you know what? It's going to get better.
Mm-hmm.
But when we get into the whole, KPIs, where are we at that? It's like, really, I recommend just put that off to the side for a little bit. I think it's probably not what we need to focus on right now.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Take a deep breath and focus on the things that you can more or less control, which is very much short term right now.
Yeah.
And not get wound up over some of that other stuff. As you look at traditional managers who are now having to manage a remote workforce,
Yeah.
and a workforce that's used to coming into the office, now working from home, and not only working from home, but working from home where the kids are probably cooped up with them in many cases, or for younger employees, they're there with roommates who are also working remotely in a cramped living room type setup in a shared
Right.
apartment. How, as a manager, how should I be looking at managing the day-to-day performance of my team? What tips would you have for someone who's had to shift to this new role?
This is kind of tricky, Chip, because I really don't believe in a cookie cutter approach here. I mean, in general, rule of thumb, we should be communicating more than we generally would because of the situation as it is right now. I get that. Don't leave people out. Makes sense. But everyone has jobs to do and work that needs to be done. And if we're on the phone all day on conference calls, how are we going to get anything done? It's kind of a catch-22 there. The other thing that complicates it is when we look at our employees, depending upon the individual, there are going to be different needs with human contact. And some employees, you know them, they want to chit chat, they want to socialize, and they're stuck in a house, maybe by themselves. And the more interaction they have, the better. So with some employees on your team, maybe you have a little bit more interaction because that's what they need. Other employees are really focused on just getting the job done. They want to minimize the conversation because they're working on something. They want to get it done. They want to get it done right. So give them a little space. Like maybe they don't need to participate on all the calls. Maybe they can, and have some one-on-one conversation with them because when working with them, that's going to kind of resonate a little bit better for them. So from a management perspective, my experience has been the managers who are best managing teams in the office, they're face-to-face, are just as good managers on remote teams because they have the people skills to know that employee A has different needs than employee B, and I'm going to adapt to each one of them to get things done more effectively. Mm-hmm. So managers who are most effective seeing everything getting done and micromanaging every step along the way are going to have a horrible time with a remote workforce because they can't see it anymore.
Right.
So being that first manager, I think is going to go a long, long ways. And understanding the individual needs of your staff and your flexibility, I think is really, really important.
Right. And I think as we said early on in this conversation, and as you've just touched on now, you need to make sure that you're still having your regular meetings with folks. So you don't necessarily need to lard up their schedule, but if you're having a regular one-on-one with your direct reports every week, as you should, you certainly need to make sure you don't let it go by the wayside. If you let it go by the wayside because you were in the office and you saw them every day, first of all, I'll tell you, even in the office, that's a bad idea. You should still have scheduled one-on-ones, even if you see someone every day at the water cooler and all that. It's not the same having that scheduled. But certainly right now, make sure you're having those scheduled one-on-ones. Make sure that you don't let the team meetings go because people do need to feel some sort of connection to each other.
I've also seen a lot of organizations, they'll do like every other Friday, they'll do a virtual happy hour. Right. And then maybe they'll do like bingo, or I have one client, they have a meditation, a yoga expert who they're in a park. So they're in an area where they can be in a park for one thing, and they're just do social distancing and they can do yoga. Another one, there's like they go to, it's interesting, they go to a park and they do meditation in their cars. So they're in the park setting, and then they have a person talking to them on the phone. You could see the person, but you could see the trees and everything, and somehow that worked for them. Sometimes you have to be a little bit creative, but those are things I think that organizations are starting to do a little bit more of, just to kind of help those who are sort of socially starved.
Right. And I think finding creative solutions is a good idea at this point in time. And, try it. And if it doesn't work, take the feedback and move on. But for the most part, you're not going to cause too much harm with these experiments. Do be careful. There are certainly lines you can cross in these experiments, but for the most part, you should be okay. But, the flip side, and you talked about, I think, the managers who are having the greatest difficulty right now, the micromanagers, the people who just, the control freaks who need to know everything that's going on. Yeah. And I've seen in some agencies, folks are trying to implement new tracking. We haven't done time tracking before, but we're going to do it now. Or we increase the frequency of our video check-ins just to make sure that you're there. That's a terrible idea, right? This is not the time to put in new Big Brother type monitoring, or even Little Brother type monitoring. It's you need to show that you trust your team in this new environment.
You do, and you have to give them space, particularly those who really need the space. So many times, I get a lot of work where, we have a manager, we have an employee who's doing now what they were doing before. And the manager wants to help me manage a performance problem because he or she's not getting the number of reports they now want, or there's something added that isn't being done. And it's like, well, wait a minute. The same work is getting done now as was being done before, right? So why is there a problem? And, you have to kind of like talk them through. And that really is another example of the situation making something a problem that really wouldn't have been a problem before. And managers need to be adaptable and recognize that, and a little bit more flexible on their side, and just kind of back off a little bit.
Yeah, and I think the flexibility is important too, because folks do have different home situations. They're being affected by that differently. People are affected differently by being cooped up all the time. There are some people who are frankly, even thriving on it that I've talked to. They're like, this is great. I don't have to really deal with people in person. It's fantastic. But then there are the people who are just out of their minds, going crazy. And part of it depends on the jurisdiction and how strict the rules are about, what you can do outside of the home.
Right.
Certainly employees have additional potential challenges if they have health risks or family members in their household have health risks. So how do you support employees through the various challenges that they may be having now that are not necessarily directly performance related, but certainly end up impacting performance over time?
A lot of it is just having the conversation, asking the question, how are you doing? How do you feel about that? What's your situation? Can we help you? What can we do better to support you? Those kind of questions go a long way, but as we start to transition back to the office, there are going to be some challenges we're going to face. And, I think we're going to need to be asking the right questions of employees without asking the wrong questions. So for instance, if someone has a medical problem that will put them in a high risk category, you can't ask them if they have a medical problem. But what you can do is you could check every employee's temperature as they come into the building. I mean, in rule of thumb, if you do it consistently, it's generally going to be okay. If you target certain populations, it's probably not going to be okay. But we have an obligation as employers to make sure we keep our employees safe. And those who are at high risk status, we want to pay attention to.
That's a great transition to probably the last topic that I really want to make sure we cover, which is, going back to the office, because this is very much on the minds of the agency owners I'm talking to right now who have physical offices, and they're starting to, as the stay-at-home rules are being relaxed in a lot of different places, and it is sort of a hodgepodge, so not everybody who's listening to this is going to be in the same situation.
Right.
But everybody's sort of at least starting to think about, well, what does it mean to reopen my office? And you've touched on one important area from an HR perspective, which is being able to put measures in place that protect the whole team. So, and federal regulators have basically said there is a fair amount of latitude here, and they've issued some guidance that says that it's okay to take employees' temperatures. It's okay to ask them, if they've traveled to somewhere where there's a high rate of infection. It's okay to ask people to stay home if they've traveled. So there's a lot of additional leeway that employers are being given. You obviously, as an agency leader, need to think through how much of that leeway do you want to take advantage of, and what kind of rules do you want to put in place for your own team.
Right, and there'll be the legally mandated things you have to do, but then there's a whole wide area of things that you can do that fall within that. So you just want to make sure that, you don't fall in a situation where you're doing what's legally required, but, reputationally you've put your team and your organization in a bad space because perhaps you haven't been taking some of the safeguards that you could easily do. Simple things, start thinking about personal protection equipment that employees are going to need when they're back in the office. Start thinking about social distancing. Having employees working on the same long table is probably not going to be a workable solution, in the new world. How do you get that social distance? Having some inexpensive plastic barriers up are things that you can do to really protect your employees in this new environment. We don't have all the answers right now, but as business owners, we should be thinking about that right now. And getting some of those PPEs, if you want to start ordering them now, would probably be a good time to do that.
Yeah, because some of these things are going to take a fair amount of lead time to implement, so you want to start thinking them through. I think in general, I can say most of the agency owners I'm talking with they're not in a rush to reopen their offices,
right?
Nor should they be, because for the most part, most agencies can work pretty effectively remotely. There's no doubt that some of them work better in an office setting, but if you've got the flexibility to delay that date, you're probably better off, even though it means you're paying rent or a mortgage on space that you're not using, which is, I get it, it's painful financially. But at the same time, imagine the pain if you bring people back too soon and end up in a bad situation. I think caution is very much advised, and the more time that you think it through, the more you can put the right solutions in place.
And you should also be thinking about what types of reasonable accommodations, if they're requested by your employees, you think you will be able to make, which will allow the business to still get done.
Right. And I think the reasonable accommodations are going to be particularly important because it appears that in most places, schools will not be reopening until the fall.
Nope.
Most summer camps in most areas look like they'll be either canceled or substantially modified, which means
Right.
that anyone with young kids is going to have challenges.
Yep.
Certainly folks who have health issues themselves, or again, at-risk people in their
Yep.
household that they're potentially exposing, they may be uncomfortable coming in. So I think you need to be prepared for that, but I also think you need to be working now in collaboration with your team to start thinking these issues through. So don't sit in your own home, maybe with a couple of other executives or an outside consultant trying to think it through. Engage the rest of your team and talk with them. What do you think? Are you anxious to get back to the office? Would you rather wait? What suggestions do you have for how we can make the office a good place? They'll come up with some good suggestions, but more importantly, they'll feel involved,
Yep.
which will help deal with some of their anxieties.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that involvement will have a direct relation on their anxiety level being lower. And instead of being a victim, they can be part of the solution.
Right. And some of these things, as you said, are going to take time. If you're ordering PPE, that's going to take some time
Yeah.
to get. If you're looking at having more hand sanitizer around, or disinfecting wipes, or any of those kinds of things, that's going to take some time. You
Yeah.
may need to spend some time, if you're in a shared office environment, you may need to work with other tenants and landlords to coordinate on your approach to shared areas.
Sure.
So, there's a lot of things that you really need to make sure that you're carefully thinking through, so that you end up giving the best possible scenario for your team.
Speaking of shared environments, I know there's some specials going on now with a lot of the vendors in those spaces. So
Yeah.
if you feel like you do need to get your employees together in the relative near future, you might want to think about asking what kind of specials. I've gotten a few calls myself.
Right.
So.
Well, and you should be thinking through, all of the big picture things, like things that you never really even think about, like cleaning of your office.
Right.
You need to be talking to whatever cleaning service you're using and figure out what are their plans.
Right.
And if you want to do a deep cleaning or something like that, what is that going to cost? Can you even find people who will do that? I know some agencies are looking right now to secure deep cleaning of their offices before they reopen. And first of all, that's not cheap.
Right.
And secondly, it turns out that kind of thing's in a lot of demand right now. So
Yeah.
you need to be thinking through that. I mean, most of us, we were happy if someone collected our trash at the end of the day, cleaned up the crumbs in the break room, and it looked like they had maybe dusted once in the last half century. But now you're really going to have to give a lot more thought to some of those cleaning practices, I think.
You are. And, where you're going to have your employees located, the building may have an agreement they have in place, like as you're potentially going to go back to your same place or go somewhere else, how they've answered those questions and figured out those problems could be a key factor for you in terms of where you want your employees to come back to.
Right. And I know a lot of agencies are using environments like WeWork,
Yep.
and those organizations have been coming up with their own policies. And
Right.
I know they're in the process of communicating some of those to their members, and that may or may not work for you. So you'll need to figure out. I mean, I was
Right.
talking with one agency leader recently, and WeWork had given them some new guidelines for the space that they use, and they're like, "Well, that's just not going to work for us because we couldn't get our whole team in." And
Right.
for us, it does. If we're going to bring people together, we want them all together. So
Right.
they would have to look at either a substantial expansion or something else. So you need to make sure that you're talking these things through and figuring out what is the right approach for your team going forward.
Right.
There are some people who think that this is the advent of everybody being virtual and remote. I don't think that's the case, but I think it is certainly going to change the way agencies are approaching where their team works, how their team works, and all that.
As disruptive as this has been, Chip, I think there are some things we can take from this that we can use in the future. So, for instance, this conversation that we're having over Zoom, I think there's a place for this in a little bit bigger prominence than we've used in the past. And, yes, it's been disruptive, but I do think there's some good things that are going to come out of this as well, too. We still have a little bit more to learn, but it feels like it's going to work out okay.
Mm-hmm. Are there other words of wisdom or things that you think agency leaders should be thinking about as we're sort of going through these disruptive times, what should they be keeping in mind that we haven't already addressed in this conversation?
The one that sticks out for me, and I say this with my clients and their employees when I'm helping them through issues, is just take a breath, just relax. Understand that the anxiety that you may be having with your employees or in your work situation might have its roots somewhere else. And sometimes, just kind of taking a step back, it's okay to kind of pause a conversation and pick it up in another day. Sometimes that after a night's sleep, it looks totally different. I think everyone's really trying to do their best they can right now, and kind of taking the leadership role to kind of step back a little bit and understand a little bit more before kind of jumping to conclusions can be a good step in the right direction, I think.
Yeah, I think the advice to sleep on things is particularly prudent right now, because we're all, I mean, no matter what level we're at in an organization, we're all feeling some level of stress that's not normal.
Yeah.
And so, we need to make sure that we're making clear-headed decisions as much as possible. So, I've been advising people, ideally you sleep on it overnight,
Yep.
but at the least go out and walk around the block if you're still allowed to do that, or
Yeah.
pace around your basement, or whatever. do something to take a little bit of time to clear your head before you make any important decisions, or before you say things that you can't take back.
Yeah.
In the course of talking with, whether it's employees or clients or vendors or whatever. So,
Yeah.
I think that's fantastic advice.
Great.
Well, Patrick, if someone is interested in learning more about Ignition HR, where can they find you?
On email, it's patrick@ignitionhr.com, or by phone, I'm in Maryland, 410-656-9660. You can
And
always check out ignitionhr.com as well.
perfect. And we'll include all of that in the show notes for this episode and for this webinar replay. So, Patrick, I really appreciate the time that you've taken here to be the first guest on the first ever live Chats with Chip episode. I think there's a lot of practical advice in here for agency owners as they try to figure out how to navigate the HR challenges in the current environment. And hopefully it will help them make sounder, clearer decisions in their own businesses.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Patrick.